Have you ever found one of your own hairs knitted into one of your projects? If you're a knitter, the answer is almost certainly yes. In fact, if you've ever owned a handmade sweater, scarf, beanie, an emotional support chicken, or any kind of mysterious project sitting in a tote bag under your bed, there's a very good chance that there is somebody's hair in it. Usually that's an accident. Personally, I'm pulling my own hairs out of my whips daily. I have very long hair and I frequently wonder how I still have any on my head when I look at how much hair I'm shedding daily. And don't get me started on pet hairs. That's a battle I lost a long time ago. I don't think any of us are considering, when we're carefully selecting the next yarn for our next project, that we may be creating a custom fiber blend that might also consist of 5% human. It's giving limited edition alpaca merino arley blend. In fact, I would be genuinely surprised if there are any hand knitted items in this house that don't contain either my hair, my cat's hair, my dog's hair, or some terrifying combination of all three. That's just part of being a knitter. But what if I told you that historically, some people added their hair to their knitting on purpose? And they weren't just messy or in need of a lint roller. They actually believed that knitting their own hair into the project could bind them and the person they were knitting it for together forever. Chapter 1. The sweater that bound us together. Historically, hair is one of the most commonly used items in magic. And why? Because, unlike our blood, it can be collected safely. Unlike clothing, it's physically a part of you. And unlike your fingerprints, it doesn't disappear. Many cultures viewed hair as carrying identity, spiritual memory, essence. And this logic is called sympathetic magic. The basic principle is, things that were connected remain connected. Therefore, hair remains connected to the person that it came from. An object containing that hair remains connected to that person. And hair was considered particularly powerful. After all, it grew from your body. So if a strand of your hair was knitted into a garment, a part of you traveled with it. It became more than a sweater or a shawl. It became a bridge. It became a physical reminder that the maker and the wearer remained connected, even when very far apart. But there was another part to the spell, which was the knitting itself. Because long before neuroscientists started studying about how mindfulness could get you into a flow state, people had already noticed something very interesting about repetitive crafts. Knitting in particular had a very specific rhythm. The hands keep moving while the mind drifts into a very focused, calm state. And many ancient folk traditions believed that this gave them the opportunity to pour their thoughts and their intentions into the garment that they were making. For example, if you knitted a sweater and you thought about someone's safety, you could be giving them protection. If you knitted a little pair of baby socks while thinking of your grandchild's happiness, these little socks could carry comfort. And if you knitted a scarf while thinking loving thoughts, well, according to folklore, those feelings became a part of the fabric itself. But this brings us to a crucial part of this puzzle, the knot. Across many magical traditions, knots are symbolic of binding, sealing, protecting, and preserving. And with knitting, every stitch is essentially a little knot. Thousands of loops, each one secured by the last one before it. Thousands of opportunities to reinforce intentions. So, from folklore perspective, this spell was not cast with a wand or a pentagram or some sort of dramatic Latin incantation. It was cast one stitch at a time, quite literally, until the finished garment contained not only yarn and fibre, but also the hopes, wishes, and intentions of the person who made it. Now, of course, this raises one very important question. If you can knit a spell into a garment, can you also break that spell? According to textile folklore, yes, absolutely. Many traditions believed that a spell created through threads, fibers, and knots would only truly be undone by reversing the process that created it. Which brings us to every knitter's greatest fear, frogging. For the non-knitters in the room, frogging is what we call unraveling a project. You pull on your carefully crafted masterpiece and watch it unravel one stitch at a time. It's actually truly a very physically painful process. And it's called frogging because you rip it, and according to folklore, this doesn't just destroy the garment, it destroys the spell. As the stitches unravel, the knots disappear, and the structure holding all of those intentions together falls apart. The energetic bridge between the maker and the wearer disappears. At least that's what believers will tell you. But what if the garment can't be unraveled? What if it felted? What if you've been wearing it for decades and the fabric's become one absolutely tangled mess? What if there's no possible practical way to frog this garment? Well, folklore has answers for that too. You cut it or burn it. Many folk traditions believed that fire was the ultimate purifier. If an object carried unwanted influence, reducing it to ashes destroyed the physical anchor that connected that spell to this world. A slightly dramatic solution for a cardigan, perhaps, but then again, no one's ever accused folklore of being subtle. Not all traditions require such drastic measures, though. A lot of practitioners believed that magical objects simply weakened over time. A forgotten shawl folded away in your cupboard, a sweater left unworn in the back of your wardrobe, a blanket packed into the attic and forgotten. Without attention, use, or quite specifically emotional connection, the magic was thought to gradually fade until it was really just an object. And then there's the gentlest approach of them all, washing. Certain folk traditions believed that water could cleanse. A careful and intentional washing was thought to remove any old emotions, old attachments, or just influences, and leave the garment spiritually clean. Now, whether any of this is literally true is up to you, but I will admit, the next time I have to frog out 3 weeks worth of knitting because I wasn't paying attention at my increase marker, I might choose to believe I'm not destroying the object. I'm simply breaking an accidental textile spell. Chapter 2. Spinning, Weaving, and Fate. Now, before we dismiss all of this as an elaborate excuse for finding hair in our knitting, it's worth remembering that the idea of thread being able to carry memory is way older than knitting itself. In fact, for most of human history, thread wasn't just useful, it was miraculous. Long before pottery, long before metalwork, possibly even long before agriculture, for an immeasurable amount of time, humans were collecting little fibers that had been blowing away in the wind, and they transformed them into something continuous, lasting, and useful. They transformed them into thread. This could be why so many cultures looked at thread as something way deeper than just thread. Because in a lot of ways, creating cloth looks a lot like creating life. You start with chaos, a handful of loose fibers. Maybe it's a tangled mess with no purpose. And then slowly and patiently, a little twist at a time, a thread emerges. Your thread becomes yarn, your yarn becomes fabric, and fabric becomes something that can shelter, protect, and maintain survival. It's not that far-fetched to see why ancient civilizations looked at this process and thought to themselves, maybe this is how destiny works too. The ancient Greeks did. They believed that every human life was controlled by three sisters known as the Fates. The first sister, Clotho, spun the thread. The second sister, Lachesis, measured it. And the third sister, Atropos, carried a pair of shears, and she cut it. And when she cut your thread, the life would end. And terrifyingly, not even Zeus, the king of all of the gods, could stop her. But wait, it gets even weirder. The Romans told a very similar story, and Norse mythology. They believed that these three sisters were called the Norns, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld. The names translate to what was, what is, and what shall be. Together, they sat beneath the roots of the Yggdrasil, which is the great walled tree that connected the 9 realms of life, tending to the source of life itself, while weaving the destinies of the gods and the mortals alike. It was believed that if a warrior fell in battle, it was not because he made a mistake or he was weak or even that the gods abandoned him. It was because somewhere in the great tapestry of his existence, the thread of his life had reached the point where it was always destined to end. And what fascinates me about this mythology in the Greek, the Roman, and the Norse is that it doesn't end there. This story is available in cultures all around the world. Cultures separated by geography, language, time. Like a lot of time. We're talking centuries of cultural development, and they all arrived at the same little mythological story. Because if this story only arrived in Europe, we could just, call it a little quirky one. But it also shows up in India. They describe the universe as a woven creation. The loom is like a model for existence. The crossing of thread becomes the very way that they understand the relationship between spirit and matter. Reality itself is imagined as a fabric being woven. I found it in Australia. Among Australian indigenous cultures, string and fibre work often carried meaning far beyond utilitarian work. It became a way of preserving ancestry, culture, identity, and a way that they connected to the land itself. They treated a line of string like a pathway on a map, or almost like a story. And it talks about the relationships of the people, the ancestors who came before them. It was much larger than thread itself. I found it in Africa. Across many traditional tribes in Africa, textile tradition is very connected to language, knowledge, and creation. In tribes such as the Dogon of Mali, weaving traditions created a link between cloth, speech, and the unfolding of the universe itself. Elsewhere, I found stories of Anansi the spider, who describes a world where history, stories, and fates are gathered together like strands in a web. Spiders appear often as creators, a very patient weaver who creates order out of chaos. I found it in Asia. In China, one of the most endearing folk beliefs is the red thread of fate, an invisible thread said to connect people who are destined to meet one another. The thread can stretch, it can tangle, but it cannot break. In Japan, braided threads were a symbol of connections and relationships, the invisible ties that bind human lives together. Once again, destiny is not imagined as this road. It's not a book. It's not a prophecy, it's thread. At some point you stop and you ask yourself, why? Why did all these people separated by oceans, language, and lots of time all come to the same conclusion? Why did they look at thread and see destiny? They immediately linked weaving to creation. They looked at knots and they saw power. It could be connected to the fact that textile work does evokes something that definitely feels magical. It definitely gives structure to chaos. It often gives something strong enough to survive generations. So, if a thread can hold a garment together, can it hold a memory, a promise, or even a soul? A little side rant. One of the reasons I find this particular story so fascinating is because I watch a lot of NDE accounts, like a lot. And one thing that comes up surprisingly often is this description of reality itself being this interconnected, woven, geometric type of thing. A lot of people who have crossed over and come back describe seeing all these little lights that represent all of us and a little thread that connects all of us together, and a lot of them are shown from a far distance, how it genuinely does create this tapestry of life. I do find that fascinating. Chapter 3, Fishermen, Protection, and the Sea. We're right back at Maritime folklore. If you thought we were done with it, we're not. We touched on some of it in episode 1, but while I was digging around on the internet, I found more. For most of human history, I would say still now, but anyway, the ocean was a terrifying place. Today, some of us think the ocean is a very beautiful place. You know, we think of holidays, sunset walks on the beach, maybe a little cruise ship. But for the people who lived on the coast and worked at sea, it was a very different story. The ocean can be very unpredictable, dangerous, and in some cases deadly. Storms can appear without warning. Birds could disappear without a trace. A man could leave home in the morning and never return. So when you live with that kind of uncertainty, you start to look for something that might make you feel safe. And that's where folklore thrives. Across coastal communities throughout Europe, fishing families created traditions and rituals and beliefs which were intended to protect the ones that they loved, the ones heading out to sea. There were some who refused to speak certain words before going on the vessel. There were others who carried little charms. There were instances of some that avoided specific animals before a voyage. And when I say avoided, I don't mean they preferred not to see them. I mean, there were some fishermen who would turn around and go home if they encountered an animal while they were on their way to the ship. Maritime folklore is absolutely filled with animal taboos, and some of them are quite bizarre. Perhaps the most feared of all was the pig. Among many fishing communities, pigs were considered catastrophically unlucky. Some believed that they could somehow influence the weather itself, like they could call in strong winds and bad weather, even if the sky was completely calm. Others felt that because pigs couldn't swim, merely mentioning them upon a vessel was an insult to the sea and an invitation to drown. Little disclaimer, pigs can swim. They're actually excellent swimmers. This one is 100% an old wives' tale. It stems from the belief that the piggy hooves are very sharp and their necks were usually quite low. And it painted a graphic and kind of gruesome image of the piggy trying to swim and accidentally. But it's not true. Pigs are great swimmers and they're really cute. The superstition was so strong that many sailors refused to say the word pig at all. They instead used nicknames like referring to them as the fellow with the curly tail. Bringing pork or bacon onto a fishing vessel was unfathomable, and if it did get found, it was going overboard. Rabbits and hares inspired a similar level of panic. Across Britain, Ireland, and Scotland, rabbits were strongly associated with witchcraft. It was believed that witches could take on the form of a rabbit or a hare and then use their powers to bring misfortune. Seeing a rabbit on your way to the vessel could be a sign that terrible things were on their way. It doomed the voyage before it even begun. And just like pigs, the animal's name became so feared it was never mentioned. They gave it alternative names like the magpie or the old bobtail, or my favorite, the underground gentleman. And apparently this superstition persisted well into the 20th century. Some fishing skippers became so uncomfortable when hearing the word rabbit being spoken that when early radio stations would begin broadcasting advertisements or things like livestock reports, they would switch them off entirely. There were also foxes. In some Irish fishing communities, seeing a fox on your way to the harbour was exceptionally bad luck. It was so closely associated with misfortune that if your rival shouted the word fox at you, it could have cursed you. Cats, on the other hand, occupied a very strange middle ground. They were either lucky or unlucky, depending entirely on their behavior. If a cat approached a fisherman on his way to his vessel, it was a sign of prosperity, of very good luck. If the cat ran away from him, disaster. They sometimes carried cats' tails to protect them from storms. If they saw a cat grooming itself in a very particular way, it was meant to be an interpretation that there was a big storm coming. And if all this sounds exhausting, it gets worse. Because sometimes just speaking these words out at sea was significantly worse than seeing one of them. If an inexperienced sailor accidentally let one of these words slip, then the crew believed the curse needed to be broken immediately. And the remedy was known as cold iron. Crew members would rush to go touch a little bit of cold iron anywhere on the ship. It could have been the chain for an anchor or a nail. Iron was widely believed to repel bad spirits, bad luck, or any supernatural influences. So in other words, it acted like a little emergency reset button in these instances. And then you take a step back and you look at all of these things together and you see a little pattern emerging. Yes, the sea was unpredictable, dangerous, and occasionally lethal. Yes, people had very little control over what happened to that vessel once it disappeared over the horizon. So they created rituals and rules to protect themselves. Anything to create even the smallest sense of control over elements they really had no control over. But this does bring us back to knitting. A lot of them placed their faith in the garments that they wore. Long before, sport shops offered us windbreakers and other great things, a fisherman's clothing was the only thing standing between him and the elements. A good sweater could be the difference between comfort or misery, between working effectively and efficiently or becoming dangerously cold. So it's not all that surprising that progressively these garments became associated with protection as well. Not only protection from the weather, protection from fate itself. And this is where we encounter one of the most famous knitting legends in all of history, the story of the fisherman's sweater, particularly the Gansey, a hard-wearing wool garment worn specifically around the British and Irish coasts. These sweaters were in fact a remarkable piece of engineering. They were very dense and very durable. They were designed to withstand years of wind and spray and hard labor, but they were also covered in patterns. And over time, stories began to grow around those patterns. Certain cables were said to represent ropes, others were fishing nets. There were some that represented ladders, anchors, and pathways home. This sweater became far more than just clothing. It became a collection of symbols stitched into wool. It was almost like a wearable prayer. It was my favorite kind of good luck charm. But the fascinating part wasn't just the symbolism representing protection. Some of it came from the fact that it actually worked. If we take the fisherman's rib, for example, it sits at a really fascinating crossroad between practical survival and, we could say, textile armor. Because unlike many decorative motifs that had been collected over time, the fisherman's rib earned its reputation through performance. The technique created an unbelievably thick fabric by working into the stitch itself rather than just going row by row. It's somehow dense and lofty at the same time. And for fishermen working in the freezing air of the North Sea, trapped air was not a luxury. It was survival. Those pockets of air were warmed with body heat and created insulation against the wind, the rain, and otherwise intolerable conditions. Even when the fabric became damp, it still provided a warm protection. To modern knitters, this sounds like textile engineering, but to a 19th century sailor facing a gale force northern winter, it probably felt like magic. The construction of these garments added another layer of folklore. Traditional ganzi was often worked in continuous round, traditionally with double-pointed needles. So naturally this produced a garment with little to no seaming. And in maritime tradition, this created an association with an unbroken line, a complete circle, if you will. Practically, the reason was that seams can sometimes feel uncomfortable. Also, they can fail at weak points. But folklore has a habit of building on top of your practical foundations. Over time, stories emerged that the unending seam provided the protection itself, a continuous shield between the wearer and the dangers of the ocean. It was also very flexible. It had a great stretch to it, which was very important to fishermen who needed to do things like throw ropes and haul nets, climb rigging. He needed clothing that moved with him. This fabric could stretch and recover almost instantly, which is again entirely practical. But again, it doesn't take long for something practical to develop an aura of something much greater. And then there's perhaps the most haunting piece of maritime folklore. The stitch patterns found on a fisherman's sweater could identify who he was and what family he came from. If a sailor was lost at sea, and if he was returned, washed up on the shores, usually the only thing left that did survive that journey would be the sweater that he was wearing. And usually that is how they could identify who the individual was. Historians have debated if any of these stories are true. But the fact that the legends exist at all tells us something. These garments weren't just ordinary clothing. They carried identity, memories, they carried family and protection. And in some folklore stories, they carried these fishermen back home. When someone you love faces danger every single day, you want to do everything you can to help them. Even if there's very little you can do. Even if all you can do is knit them a sweater. And sometimes that sweater is the magic. And those needles were your ones. And maybe while they were being made, a few little hopes and intentions were woven into them. Safe journeys, calm seas, and a quick return home. Which brings us back to hair binding magic. Because once you've accepted the idea that a garment can carry magic, that a pattern can carry meaning, the idea of knitting a literal piece of yourself no longer sounds quite that strange. And while through the different communities and traditions, they all develop their own meanings, their own symbols, their own patterns, I think it's safe to say that they all looked at these stitches and they saw more than a pretty cable or a fun technique. And I really find that very beautiful. Chapter 4, The Museum of Witchcraft. At this point, you might think that all of these stories sound a little bit crazy. It sounds like superstition. Maybe we've spent the last half an hour taking really normal textile traditions and read far too much into them. And maybe that is fair criticism. After all, finding symbolism in thread is one thing. Finding actual magical textiles, well, that's an entirely different. Except there's one small problem. They do exist. Or at least people genuinely believed they did. Because tucked away in a small Cornish village by the name of Boscastle, don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, is one of the strangest collections of objects they are available to us. The Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. And amongst thousands of items are some artifacts that really blur the line between craft, folklore, superstition, and spell work in ways that are genuinely fascinating and a little mind-boggling. Inside this museum, you will find things like knotted cords, protective charms, witch bottles, objects created to attract luck, objects created to repel misfortune, some to heal, some to curse. But woven through all of these collections runs a little theme: thread, string, cords, and knots. Again, we're encountering the exact same thing that's followed us throughout this entire story. Okay, normally it's swords and crystals and elaborate magical machinery, but not this time. This time it's string, which, if you really think about it, is probably one of the most human forms of magic that exists, because string is one of the oldest tools we've ever invented. It's also one of the simplest, and yet people continue to use it to represent things that they cannot see. Things like luck and love, protection, fate, memory, identity, and sometimes, according to folklore, it is power itself. One particularly common example is knot magic, the belief that an intention can be tied into a cord and then released again later if you want to. This way you could store a little blessing. Even wind was believed to be able to be captured inside of a knot and released, one knot at a time, by sailors seeking favorable weather. And whether anyone truly believes they were carrying the weather in their pockets is difficult to know, but what we do know is people carried these cords. People did tie these knots, and they were preserved in these museums. So I guess not evidence that the magic worked, but definitely evidence that they believed it. And that's kind of a beautiful segue through all of these points, because throughout this entire journey, from the fates, the Norns, the fishermen, the sweater with the hairs in them, we keep encountering the same theme, that thread has intention. It's a physical act of transforming the invisible into an object. And yeah, this could well be why fiber art comes up quite a lot in folklore. Like quite a lot. I have probably seasons worth of content. My God. Chapter 5. Should I do it? So after everything we've talked about today, there's only really one question left. Should I knit my hair into my sweater? Well, firstly, congratulations. You have successfully found the weird corner of the internet. From a completely practical perspective, that answer would be no. While it can absolutely get trapped inside of your knitting, it has a tendency of just working its way back out again, which really just means that today's lovingly enchanted garment could well be tomorrow's scratchy cardigan. And then, you know, there's consent. You might have a little bit of a hard time explaining why so many of your hairs are inside your scarf, like some kind of textile horror movie. So just as a fiber choice, I wouldn't recommend it. There are better options: merino, alpaca, cashmere. And yet, after spending all of this time exploring folklore, tradition, superstition, and textile traditions from all around the world, I think the most interesting part of hair binding isn't really whether or not that spell works. It's why people wanted it to. At its heart, it isn't really talking about witchcraft at all. It's mostly talking about people wanting to protect the people that they love. It's talking about wanting to leave a little bit of yourself behind. And whether that's going to take on the form of a little knotted cord or a fisherman's rib sweater, a herring weave shawl, or some accidentally trapped hair, the ideas remain very similar. We just want to take things that are ordinary and we want them to carry something. We want them to carry our intentions, our hopes, and our wishes. And so that's probably why these stories lasted so long. Maybe thread does control human fate. Maybe it does, because humans have always used thread to make the things that matter the most. And I think that is far more magical than a spell. Thank you for spending some time with me, and happy knitting. And I will see you next week. Bye.